Good afternoon and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. And with that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Taylor Hagood. Dr. Hagood is Professor of American Literature at Florida Atlantic University and a former Fulbright professor that he spent at the University of Munich in Germany. He is one of the world's leading scholars on the writing of William Faulkner. However, today's talk will be on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's works on Sherlock Holmes. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Haggard. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. I do appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to see everyone. I am very excited about this opportunity, and I was very happy to see that one of my colleagues, Samir Hinduja, has given one of the talks for this series. And so it's an honor to me to be able to do that as well. Very excited to get to speak to you today about Sherlock Holmes and his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And with that, I want to go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can have something to look up to here in addition to myself. Now, I want to give you an idea of what I'm really looking to do today. Now, we're going to talk about the lifetime of a fictional character. Okay, so we are going to think about who this character is, think about how he came into existence, but there's something bigger at stake, and that is, what is a character? Sherlock Holmes is a great case study, if I may use that term, for the larger question of how we make meaning in our world by understanding who people are. And there's a really fascinating question about where the line really should be drawn between an actual flesh and blood person and a character. This is, I think, a very interesting question, and Sherlock Holmes does a lot toward helping us to think about what exactly is involved in that. So, with that, let us begin. And I'm going to go ahead here and open the question. Thank you so much for the applause. I appreciate it very, very much here. And I want to get started. All right, so I have the two pictures here. And let me say that if you are not familiar with Arthur Conan Doyle at all, you may be surprised to see this photograph of him here. You can see here, he has a pipe, much like his character Sherlock Holmes. He has this pipe, he has this hat. He, however, does not look very much like Sherlock Holmes' character. We're going to talk about how Sherlock Holmes came to look a certain way. And of course, we have this drawing on the right that is a very early and important way of imagining who Sherlock Holmes could be. But I have here these two names, Holmes and Doyle. Holmes and Doyle, the creator and the entity who is being created. And what is their relationship? And let me say again, that what a character is very important. We understand each other and we encounter each other as people in certain ways. And a lot of times there are big questions about how we understand or what we understand people to be. All right, so with that, let us move forward a little bit and talk about Arthur Conan Doyle's life. Now, by the way, sometimes people refer to him just as Doyle, sometimes as Conan Doyle. He was later made Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. You will catch me using all of those terms because it's just, for whatever reason, I don't know, it just goes into my head that way. But let's talk about it. Now, I want to tell you something right off the bat. Okay, this photograph is probably not Arthur Conan Doyle. I want you to know this because I wanted to give you a baby picture, but I don't think there is. If there is a baby picture of Conan Doyle, I don't have it. So I just found a photograph of a Victorian baby. And of course, they put young boys in dresses at the time, interestingly enough. And I don't know. I wanted to share this picture with you. So I do want to be clear, though. I want to be very honest with you. That's not Conan Doyle. But he was born male and single. In 1859, he was born on May the 22nd in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, this might strike you as surprising or interesting because Sherlock Holmes is so English. And it might surprise you that Conan Doyle was actually Scottish. Now, he was not, in 1864, his family actually dispersed. His father had a lot of problems, and so different members of his family were moved around, and I think he was living with an uncle or an aunt or something. Anyway, and he did go to school in Lancashire, however, a place called Stonyhurst, and then he found himself from 1875 to 1876 living in Austria. So he's moving around quite a bit, born in Scotland, but living in England, then in Austria at Stella Matutina School. He goes back, though, to Scotland, to his hometown, for his work in the university, at the University of Edinburgh in 1876 to 1881. He's there at the medical school. Now, while he is in the midst of his schooling, and this is important, his schooling time is very important for the creation of Sherlock Holmes, but while he is there, there's another, a totally different set of experiences he has, and these have a lot to do with another very important character he creates. Now, what I'm talking about is that he actually becomes a doctor. He's a ship surgeon at one point on a couple of ships. So he's on the Hope. He is the doctor on the ship called the Hope. He is a surgeon on the Mayumba. And you'll notice this photograph of him here when he was young. Now, this is a photograph of him and of Doyle, Conan Doyle, and it may surprise you with the mustache and all. He may look like what you imagine Dr. Watson to look like, John Watson. And a lot of people get taken by surprise. In fact, he looks a lot like someone who would play that role later, fairly recently, and that would be Jude Law. Well, anyway, he's on the ship and he has these experiences essentially as a military doctor. And so after that, and those are experiences that will feed into his creation of Watson. But anyway, in 1882, he goes back, he basically opens his private practice in Plymouth and Southsea. 1891, however, he goes back to Austria, and he's at Vienna, where he studies ophthalmology. Now, ophthalmology was, there may be doctors in this audience who are more expert on the history of ophthalmology than I am, but it's my understanding that at this point, it was still, in the 1890s, a fairly new kind of field of study, or at least in the way we think of it. Well, after this, in the same year, he returns to England, and there in London, he sets up a private practice. But let me tell you, he didn't do a lot of doctoring, okay? He did a lot of writing. There was a lot of time waiting for patients to come along. And he was waiting for them. And when they didn't come around as quickly maybe as he'd hoped, he spent his spare time writing. Well, it turns out that he started to get some publications. Now, here's a picture of the young and ambitious doctor, or maybe the young and ambitious writer. So, interestingly, he has two publications that appear in the same month of the same year, 1879. Now, what's interesting is, notice the order. Now, he is a medical doctor. He has studied ophthalmology. He is doing cutting-edge work. However, his first publication in September the 6th, 1879, is not a medical article. It's not a medical research article. It is a story. It's fiction. The Mystery of Sasassa Valley appears in Chambers's Edinburgh Journal. Now, notice on the screen that his next publication is one that's actually in his profession, Gelsemium as a Poison, which appeared in the British Medical Journal. Now, what I love about this is not only does he write fiction first, but when he does get around to writing or publishing in the same month, he's obviously writing these at the same time. When he does publish some research, it has to do with poison. On his way to Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes hadn't been thought of yet, but he was thinking about him actually quite a lot, because he had a professor back at the University of Edinburgh. His name was Joseph Bell. And here's a picture of him looking very stalwart. And he was very interesting because he was very observant. You could walk into the room and he had a little game he played. He would look at your shoes and he would look at your fingernails and he would look maybe at your hair and then the wear on your collar, on your cuff or your collar. And he would start drawing conclusions about where you had been, who you were, if you were married or not, all these things. And what he would do is say, I observe and deduce, that's a key word, that you are blah, 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 blah. You're from the East End of London and you spent the morning, digging a grave or something. So he would talk about that, and everybody would be blown away. They would be so amazed that he could do this and wonder, how did he do it? And then he would explain, well, I noticed your cuff, and I noticed your shoes, the dirt on your shoes, and so forth and so on. And then when he explained it, it was clear as day. Well, that sounds like someone you know. Yeah. This was the guy that Sherlock Holmes essentially was built on, a man of reason. Now, that's an interesting thing because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a person who was an enlightened figure. He was a person of science. And yet there was a part of him that wasn't at all. And there's an interesting divide in him. And Sherlock and Watson, in some ways, represent that divide, this sort of romantic on one side, very scientific on another. Now, here's an interesting question. What is the relationship between a character and the character's author? Can a character be something other than the author, or coming out of the author's mind? Is the character always tied? Is there kind of an umbilical to the author somehow? It's a very intriguing question, I think, about any character. But Sherlock Holmes, again, is a special case. Well, Doyle did get married to Louisa Hawkins. They married in 1885. They had a very strong relationship, at least early on. However, and let me say, he remained very devoted to her, even though she developed quite a few health problems as the years went along. We'll come back to that in just a little bit time later. Well, in 1887, finally, Doyle manages to create this character, this super sleuth. Now, he was not the first person to do this. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe, of all people, had written a couple of stories that were essentially mystery stories in the style of a detective who is a kind of superhero. So the Purloined Letter, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, they both feature this character, Dupin. By the way, they're very interesting stories. I highly recommend you reading them if you have some time, and, if you're interested. And so there were some others, but Poe is really, many people think of as being the kind of the original person to create this character who is a detective, but has this personality. It's not just about solving the story. That's important. And a mystery story is interesting because it layers narrative. You have the narrative of the criminal that the criminal is generating to hide the true narrative of a crime. And then you have the overarching narrative of how the detective solves the case. So you have this layering, at least 3 layers typically in a mystery story. And there are certain set types. There is the so-called locked room. In other words, a murder has been committed or something. But the room that it happens in, where the dead body is, can only be locked from the outside. So how did the person who committed the crime get out? This is in the Murders in the Rue Morgue. Similar kind of situation with the Purloined Letter by Poe. I don't want to give away these stories in case you haven't read them. Well, Doyle brought in that Poe precedent, and he created this character, and that character, Sherlock Holmes, based on also Joseph Bell, a real-life person, but also drawing from Doyle himself, that side of him that believed in reason and observation and deduction and science. And he writes this story. It's a novella, a short novel or a long short story, depending on how you look at it. And it's called, the title is A Study in Scarlet. It appears in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887. And let me just tell you, it is quite a piece of work. Now, it sets up right from the beginning this situation where you have this veteran of the military, John Watson. He has been wounded in war. He is now but he ends up he becomes a roommate at 221B Baker Street, very famous address, didn't actually exist. There was a Baker Street, but not that particular address, not the 221B. So anyway, they get together, they meet up, and they become roommates, essentially. And they are in this place, and soon Watson finds that he has a very peculiar roommate, Sherlock Holmes, who calls himself a consulting detective. He is the perfect detective, let me tell you, for COVID era lockdown because he doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere. Most of his work happens right in his room. He reads the newspapers. He solves a lot of cases in his mind. Sometimes the police, especially Inspector Lestrade, they will come to visit him and say, we have this problem. He's like, yeah, I read about that. Here's the answer. Now, he does leave, of course, quite often to go do some investigating on his own. But it's an interesting concept, the consulting detective. Now, you have Inspector Lestrade and other famous inspectors. You have Watson, you have Holmes. Later on, you will see also this character, Holmes's brother, Mycroft, who's even smarter than Sherlock. So there's a cast, and of course, Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper. This cast kind of comes together as things go along. But A Study in Scarlet's very interesting. If you haven't read it, it's very, very fascinating. One of the things I love about it, and I don't have time to read much to you from these things, but I just have to share this one thing, and that is a list that Watson makes right when he meets Holmes, and he says, I've got to write down what this guy is like. Just listen to this. Sherlock Holmes, his limits. Now, Holmes doesn't have many limits. In fact, he seems to know everything, but then he says, well, I don't know everything. I just know the things I need to know. So he says, if there's something I don't need to know, I try to forget it as quickly as possible because my mind is like a lumber room and I have only enough room to put in there what I care about. So Sherlock Holmes, his limits. Knowledge of literature, nil. Knowledge of philosophy, nil. Knowledge of astronomy, nil. Knowledge of politics, feeble. I think I saw someone already asked a question about politics. Holmes would be, I think, at a complete loss to answer any question about politics. Knowledge of botany, variable. Well, up in Belladonna, opium and poisons generally. Remember, Doyle had written that piece on that. Knows nothing of practical gardening. Knowledge of geology, practical but limited, tells at a glance different soils from each other after walks, has shown me some splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistency in what part of London he had received them. Pretty interesting. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. Knowledge of anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. Knowledge of the sensational literature is immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. He plays the violin well, is an expert single stick player, boxer, and swordsman. And he has a good practical knowledge of British law, always important, of course, for detectives. Okay, well, this is Study in Scarlet. Very interesting novella, appears in 1887, and pretty much Holmes hits with a splash, and they're off to the races. Lippincott, very famous venue for publication, publishes The Sign of Four, another short novel novella, people usually call it, February of 1890. Let me just tell you, this is a tremendous work that captures what at the time would have been called Orientalism. That is, people moving, not a term we use now, of course, but at the time, people moving from the empire to the center of London. There is drug use in this thing. It's very, very edgy and shockingly contemporary, as some have recently seen with some recent television series. Well, most of the stories then that follow, so those longer two works get Holmes started off. And then Doyle began to write a series of short stories, and they began to appear in a new magazine called The Strand. Of course, you know about The Strand, probably in London, the street. Well, in 1891, in the second volume of The Strand began to appear these stories, and they are classics. A Scandal in Bohemia, which features Irene Adler, very famous story. The Ready to Lead, one of the loveliest stories in terms of tone and style in the whole canon. But you can see issue 7, issue 8, issue 9, issue 10, and so forth. These are classic stories, and with them were, and this is very important for the development of the character Sherlock Holmes, drawings by this guy, Sidney Paget. He was an illustrator. You can see a picture of him on the right, but I like the one on the left because he's wearing a Sherlock Holmes hat. That's called a deer stalker's hat. It's a hunting hat. It has a bill in the front and the back and ties up. You can also pull it down and cover your ears, which is always nice when you're out hunting in England in the winter. Well, it's actually Paget who first gives us that visual of Sherlock Holmes. Now, here's a question. When is a character born? Was this character born with Joseph Bell, the professor? Or in Doyle's mind, that seems like kind of a no-brainer. Or, though, does this character start to take on an existence off the page? Because can a character exist out of the writing that the character is presented in? That's a very profound question, I think. Very intriguing question. Well, Paget starts drawing these pictures. He bases his look for Sherlock Holmes on his brother, Walter Paget. You see him here, and of course you can see very quickly these early pictures by Paget, these illustrations, how they connect and look a lot like his brother, Walter. Here's another group of these, and of course that one that I showed you right at the beginning. Very important way of establishing what Watson looks like and what Holmes looks like. You can see them both here. Watson with the mustache, Holmes with his sort of aquiline features, the ever-present pipe. All the way in the lower part, you can see with the deerstalker hat. This is your classic Sherlock Holmes look, developed right from the beginning. It was a powerful image. Now, let me tell you, people in London loved these stories, and they were collected in a book, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. You got to read it tonight if you've never read it. Published in 1892. Now, Doyle, he just kept popping these stories out there because, hey, he made money. They sold very well. This is, of course, before television. People got the latest Strand magazine and read the latest exploit of Holmes, which was told by Watson. Now, what's interesting, though, as he writes these stories and he collects them in another book in 1893, it was published in 1894, but the last of these stories was written in 1893. As he goes along, Doyle, writing these, Doyle, let me just say about Doyle, he was a very hale and hearty man. He was a great cricket player. He was a very active mind. He had a very active mind, and he loved all kinds of writing. He wrote vampire stories and other kinds of mystery stories. He loved history. So Holmes was just sort of one thing he did. It happened to be his most, the best one financially for him. But he began to dislike Holmes. He started getting letters in the mail, did Conan Doyle, saying, well, how's Sherlock doing? And how's Watson doing? And believe it or not, Doyle actually kind of came to be jealous of Sherlock. He didn't like him. And he decided that he had made enough money and that he thought, Doyle, that he had enough of a following of his own that he could get rid of Sherlock Holmes and just write whatever he wanted to write. So he just decided he would kill his character off. Jealous of him? Kill him. Many people thought that they thought of Holmes, they might have known Holmes's name and not Doyle's. And I'll tell you what, there are a lot of people these days who will know Sherlock Holmes's name, including in a very vulgar phrase sometimes people will use. May not always know Conan Doyle's name. So he decided he would kill him off. The story is called The Final Problem. It takes place in Switzerland at Reichenbach Falls. And what happens, this is where the very famous arch enemy Moriarty comes onto the scene, Professor Moriarty. And what Moriarty does is they meet up. He is the Napoleon of crime, and they fight there at the waterfall, and they fall to their death, the two of them. That's it. The final problem. Sherlock Holmes dies. I'll just tell you, London was disconsolate. The people in London were just crushed. They got that issue of the Strand magazine, and they were just so, in their minds, not only was Sherlock Holmes real, but so was Dr. Watson. And Dr. Watson, what they realized was that Dr. Watson had been telling them these stories, written in first person, even knowing that Sherlock Holmes was dead, because they found out he had died. This last problem had happened like a year before. The whole city was a wreck. The Strand magazine wasn't able to sell any magazines. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but let me tell you, they wanted Sherlock back, and they went to Conan Doyle and said, you got to bring this fellow back. So, as is possible with fiction, Sherlock Holmes, it turns out, only faked his death, and he comes back roaring into popularity once again. And the stories that follow first were collected in this collection in 1895, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. I know you're happy that Sherlock Holmes is still alive, but how can you kill a character? How can you kill a character? Burn all the words the character's in? Huh? Does a character live outside of those words? Does a character live in people's minds and hearts? What is a character? Well, Doyle kept writing begrudgingly. He wrote more and more of these stories. He did, however, write a lovely, lovely novel, a full-length book, a novel entitled The Hound of the Baskervilles. It is a wonderfully atmospheric work. It takes place on something called the Griffin Mire. It's a kind of a moor. You can see here a photograph of it in the kind of faintly in the background. It was serialized in the Strand from 1901 to 1902 and then published. Beautiful, beautiful book. One of the great detective novels. Now, a lot of detective work appears in short stories, but this is one of the great detective novels. And it's all about this hound, this big dog that has a lot of lore around it, and it kills people. Well, Doyle continued to write, but his wife became very ill. I mentioned that before. His wife became sicker and sicker, and he began to have a relationship with this woman, Jean Elizabeth Leckey. Now, he never did divorce his wife. He actually waited on her and nursed her in her ill health later in life. But when she did pass away, he did marry this woman. Now, by the way, he had built a big house at this point, and he marries her in 1907, not too long after his wife passed away. Well, about this time, though, his interests had changed quite a lot because now he was interested in spiritualism. For spiritualism had been a very big thing in the 1800s. And I do want to tell you a little something about myself. I don't know, I guess I should have said this from the beginning. I don't know who all is on here today. I don't know if anybody here is someone that I've had the pleasure to meet or get to spend time with before. I am a professor in the English department. I'm originally from the state of Mississippi. I know you haven't seen many of us. They don't let many of us out of the state. But if I know sometimes the accent is a little unusual to people. But one other thing about me, when I was growing up, my father wore and wears many different hats. But one of those hats is that he is a magician. And when I was growing up, I had my head chopped off a couple of times and I was put back on, sort of. And I was floated around the room a few times, levitated. But I also grew up in a household that was very fascinated with magic. And there's the history of spiritualism and the history of magic are very closely linked. For example, the Davenport brothers in the 1800s did a very big spiritualism show. And they are just one example. Well, in the 20th century, in the time that Doyle comes along, there was, of course, he was born in the 1800s, but as the 1900s come on, uh, in fact, he became very interested in the idea that you could contact the spirits. And so he did have a son to die, but he was already interested in spiritualism before that. He believed fully and wholeheartedly in the Cottingley fairies. This is a photograph of them in 1917. It's a hoax, but he believed in it. He believed in spirit photographs. There's an example of one of him on the left-hand side. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting about this. This is the other side of Conan Doyle. On one hand, he's a scientist. On one hand, he is a person of reason. And yet, on the other hand, much like Dr. Watson, he's a romantic. He is a believer. He's easily swayed into believing in the supernatural. Now, I think he might have said, well, maybe the supernatural is just something we don't know enough about. And so he took a scientific approach to it. But I think in our eyes, it's hard to see that. It looks like, and I think there is truth to the fact that there is a romantic side of him. Now, he befriended, I do want to say this. He did write on this. He actually wrote a book, The History of Spiritualism. You saw it appear there, much like a spirit. 1926, this was published. Now, he became friends with no less august a personage than this gentleman, Eric Weitz. You probably know him as Harry Houdini. Now, Doyle of course, Houdini was a magician, but he also essentially invented the genre of the escape art or escape artist and that job. And, Doyle was very interesting. He had this idea that the way Houdini made his escapes is that he turned himself into a spirit and then slid out of the handcuffs and then became solid again. That was his idea. Well, Houdini tried to tell him, no, that's not how I do it. Houdini had been involved in some spiritualism as a young man, very young man, and he was very intent on debunking spiritualism. Very interesting story there. We don't have time to go into today, but he would go around and expose as much as he could. There are some things he never quite explained, but he did a lot of exposing, showing how spiritualists would use tricks from magic in order to accomplish the things they were doing. Well, Doyle and Houdini became friends, but they also, that friendship cooled because Doyle ultimately, that they weren't able to stay friends really over this, because Houdini felt very strongly he was very against charlatanry as he saw it. Well, there were some more stories, and finally, though, in 1927 was published the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. These stories, I would argue, are a little weaker than the early stories, but at the end of his life, Doyle was still writing. He died in 1930, July the 7th, age 71. You see a picture of him. He's the one with his arm around the boy there. And you can see late in life, in very, very good shape, very strong physically and mentally. And he was, and emotionally, and he was quite a figure. Well, he died, passed away. Now, what of his character? Because characters, you can kill them, but they come back to life. They might die, but they live on in the writing, but they live on in other ways too. Let's talk about that. Okay, so Sherlock Holmes, no longer encumbered by his creator. So what happens? Well, Sherlock Holmes begins to appear in other forms. So there were pictures of Sherlock Holmes. There were the stories of Sherlock Holmes, but now he comes to life on stage. There was a gentleman named William Gillette. He did not, so far as I know, have anything to do with shaving. He was from the state of Connecticut, which perhaps some people here are from that wonderful, beautiful state. I've had the great privilege of visiting there a couple of times, and I loved it very much. So well done if you're from there. But anyway, William Gillette actually he was an actor, and he wanted to put Holmes on stage. He wrote Conan Doyle. Now, Doyle had actually written a play for Sherlock Holmes that didn't really get too far. But this guy, Gillette, writes him and he says, listen, I'd like to do a Sherlock Holmes play. Is it okay if I have him get married? He wanted to have him get married to Irene Adler, a very important figure, character from Scandal in Bohemia. So Doyle, who hates Sherlock Holmes already, very famously writes back and says, you may marry him or murder or do what you like with him. This is Sherlock Holmes. He's writing this to Gillette, saying for Sherlock Holmes. Well, Gillette puts together this performance in 1899. It premieres in Buffalo, but here in the background, you can see when he made a film version, a silent film version of it that came out in 1916. That is Gillette. And of course, he looks so much like Sherlock Holmes, right? And here comes Watson on the scene as well. By the way, he built a house. If you're from the state of Connecticut, you may know about Gillette Castle. Beautiful, romantic house, has some very interesting, all the doors have different mechanisms to open them. And it's a very theatrical house, and one I don't get a kickback, but if you should want to make a trip in the summer, in the event that we should be able to make trips in the summer, you might check it out. All right then, so what else happened? So this puts Holmes both on the stage and the screen. There's something else that happens. In 1933, a guy named Vincent Sterrett publishes a book called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Now think about this. Here's a character. How can a character have a private life or any life other than what has been written? Well, so real had Sherlock Holmes become that Vincent Sterrett imagined a whole life for Sherlock Holmes. It is a biography of a fictional character. Now, that wasn't enough. There also were societies created. There was the Baker Street Irregulars, founded in 1934. There may be some Baker Street Irregulars in this audience today. I have had the privilege of meeting a number of them. The Baker Street Journal was a publication developed in that group. Now, about this time, Holmes got on screen again in such an iconic way. When I was growing up, my father always had these films on, and actually it started out as a radio program sponsored by Petri Wine. But it was also something that went to the screen. There were a series of films starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. Rathbone was a fairly athletic, fairly active kind of Holmes. Nigel Bruce was a very bumbling kind of Watson. I have here a little clip from them.
Watson! Coming, Holmes! Watson! All right, Holmes,
Now that is Nigel Bruce, and they were on a series of films. By the way, those films did get rather political at times. They appeared during World War II, and so they would take typically pro-Allied stance. Now, Sherlock Holmes Society and Journal, established in 1951. You can see how this ball is picking up steam here, right? Then in 1954, another book of stories comes out by Adrian Conan Doyle. So we have now family members writing. John, I believe Adrian is a son. John Dixon Carr, also helping with this. So now you have more Sherlock Holmes stories. You have a biography of him, more Sherlock Holmes stories. And now you have another biography in 1962 by William Baring Gould entitled Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. We're off to the races. Here is a character who has become more real than life itself. Well, let me say, later on, there was a film made of this in 1970, directed by Billy Wilder, and you can see it's got some real steam in it at times. But this is the private life. It's a little bit different idea of the private life of maybe a Sherlock Holmes. In 1972 appears a commentary. So imagine, this is by Dakin, so imagine a commentary being written on a character who never even existed. 1975 appears a film, probably one of the really great comic films starring Gene Wilder, Madeline Kahn, Marty Feldman, and others, Dom DeLuise. Let me tell you, I love this film. I happen to be a fencer with swords, and there's this a great clip from historical fencing in this film that you've got to check out. But it is very funny. In fact, Gene Wilder character, this is called Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother, who is Gene Wilder. In fact, when somebody asks Gene Wilder about Sherlock, he says, no, my brother's name is Sherlock Holmes. So this is not Mycroft. This is a different brother who doesn't quite make it on the scene typically. Now, unbelievably, in 1984 was published this book. So one of the things about Holmes is he wrote monographs. He would write monographs in which he would study different soil patterns, or he was an expert in tobacco. He could tell you where the tobacco came from. He solved entire cases with a cigarette butt. Very famous case where there's someone who's been hanged and the police can't figure out what's going on. Holmes digs around in the grate in the fireplace and he brings out a cigarette butt and he solves the whole case essentially that way. And somebody asked him, how in the world did you find it? And he says, well, it was easy. I was looking for it. Now, he wrote all of these. Holmes allegedly wrote these monographs. Well, in 1984, someone came along and actually wrote, well, I should say, edited one of these. I think two of them. The use of disguise in crime detection. That was another big deal. He loved to do a lot of things with disguise. So this is what he was doing. So let me close that. Okay, so that was in 1984. Now, I want to talk about a few other ways that Holmes comes up on screen. This is the small screen this time, and this was the series when I was a kid, the person who played Sherlock Holmes, and that was Jeremy Brett. He was a brilliant Sherlock Holmes, a person to portray Holmes. He was very cerebral and yet very athletic at the same time. I would argue that few people maybe nobody has done it as well as he has. Now, this series ran, the BBC made, and it featured a couple of actors to play the role of Watson. One was David Burke. He was the first, and he was the polar opposite of Nigel Bruce. Where Bruce was bumbling, Burke was very serious, very, very serious and edgy. Well, he gave up the role at a certain point, and Edward Hardwicke came in, and he was softer. He wasn't bumbling, but he was a kind of a blend of these two different kinds of Watsons. And Watson is interesting. Holmes doesn't, in a lot of ways, change much. Watson, there are many different interpretations of him. So it's interesting how there's a flexibility. Again, Watson is a part of Doyle's personality. Now, 1990 was built in London town. Let me just tell you, this is one of the, somebody's going to pop me in the nose when I say this, but I'm telling you right now, this is one of the nicest museums in the whole city. If you go to this place, there has now been created a 221B Baker Street. If you take the tube there, when you get out in the train station, you will see on all the tiles, you'll see little Sherlock Holmes silhouettes. This museum is absolutely brilliant. I think you will get a big kick out of it, and it's been set up. In fact, this scene behind me is, you could say I'm there right now, although unfortunately I'm not really. I should have told you that. I'm there, London town. Forget I said that. Here I am in London. You might hear the bells ringing soon. Well, this is a 1990 Sherlock Holmes Museum. You got to check it out. Still going strong as far as I know, although who knows in our time. Not to be outdone, in 1991 at Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, where Sherlock Holmes died, but didn't really die and came back to life. 1991 was built the Meringen Holmes Museum. There's a statue of him, and you can visit the falls, but watch your step there, especially if you run into Moriarty. Now, in 1994, again, just think about how much mileage people are getting out of someone who never existed. A museum about someone who never existed in a place that never existed. But in 1994 was published by this woman, Laurie Keene, the first of a series of novels that deal with a girl, a young woman, a girl who grows into a woman who basically becomes an apprentice to Sherlock Holmes. She learns from the big super sleuth master. It's a very fascinating take in a time, especially in a time when many writers, women writers, were saying, hey, you know, how can we envision women in these stories? Now, Irene Adler had been important, but with this novel and those that follow, you get a lot of this kind of thing. Now, in the 2000s, about 2010, I believe, there was another film made, but it featured an American Holmes. Now, there had been American Holmeses along the way, but I guess this one would be probably the most high profile, Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law as Sherlock Holmes, as Watson, and you can see again the resemblance to a young Conan Doyle with Jude Law. Now, I have to tell you, when I saw the previews for this one, I didn't know if I wanted to check it out, but I did, and I'm so glad I did. There were 2 films made in this series, and they were really outstanding. They were very close to the source, and Robert Downey Jr. did a fine job, I would argue. He really brings in the kind of brutal side of Holmes. Holmes was known to brawl and fist fight. And they bring this into play in very interesting ways, very cleverly done film. Well, it may have been the success of that in American Holmes that might have spurred the BBC to say, we better do something. So they started their own series. I suspect it doesn't need much introduction, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, who had formerly been on the British version of The Office. Well, wow, what can I say? There's a whole legion of fans who called themselves by the name of Cumberbatch, but they changed the A to an I. This happens. I would never say this word, but my understanding is there are people who proudly own that name. What was brilliant about this thing is it stuck. This series, the first episode is called A Study in Pink, much like A Study in Scarlet. It stuck so close to the source, and yet it brought it up to date, and in ways that were so smart. Just as Watson had come from the Middle East wounded in war back in the original Sherlock Holmes, so Watson comes wounded in the Middle East. But he doesn't write stories for magazines. He's writing a blog about his roommate. There is contact being made via text message. Very brilliant kind of work. The people who did this were very, very smart. Anyway, Benedict Cumberbatch doesn't need any introduction. Brilliant, brilliant actor. And I think there were plans for a third Robert Downey Jr. film, but I don't know if these wrecked them or what. Don't quote me on that. I don't know. It's just something I've wondered about. Anyway, in 2015 came another film. And this one was, again, took the idea of Holmes as having life beyond the writing to an extreme. Ian McKellen plays an aging Holmes who actually has dementia, and yet it goes into a flashback. He's keeping bees. This is one of the things Holmes does. That's why you have the beekeeper's apprentice. And you see an older Holmes. What was he doing in his old age? Well, there are a couple other series I just want to mention quickly, and then we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I have to mention this one because my mother is a huge fan, or was a huge fan of this series. I have on here to 2012 to the present. I think that series ended a little while ago. I meant to change that from a previous time when I gave a talk along these lines. Anyway, this one is called Elementary, and in another interesting move, it makes Watson not only female, but Asian. So it's an interesting move, Johnny Lee Miller and Lucy Liu playing in this. Now, another take around about the same time was House. It's not Watson and Holmes, but it's still the idea of a super sleuth based in the precedent of Sherlock Holmes. Well, I want to thank you so much for the applause. I appreciate that very, very much. I want to say a few things just to, in fact, I'll stop sharing my screen. I do want to say thank you. And by the way, you're more than welcome to send me an email. We'll have some time for questions, but sometimes things have to percolate, and you come back to them later. So please feel free to contact me whenever you like. But I want to say just a few things, maybe just for a minute, and say that, again, the really interesting thing here to me that has to do with fiction, writing, literature, and literary criticism on a much larger scale is, what are the functions of characters in our lives? Do we even know each other as people, or do we know each other as characters? How much do we present narratives of ourselves to other people? You know, it's interesting. We don't have newspapers exactly the way we did before. The newspaper articles tend to come on the phone, but they're kind of like I'm not saying they're fiction, but they kind of tell a narrative. You know, they present a story, and that story has many strands wrapped into them, and they are telling us. I'm not the first person to mention this. Benedict Anderson, a very important theorist, first was the one to talk about this. But it's an interesting idea that in our world, we have characters all around us. Those characters may or may not have much to do with the real people they look like, you know, but we have them presented and they make meaning. They are made to make meaning, whether in nonfiction, again, journalistic writing, or literally nonfiction, or in fiction. All of this blends together. But the idea is, who and what is a character? It's very, very intriguing thing. All right, so let's go ahead, and I believe that Karen is going to step in now to help with questions and whatever answers we can come up with.
Thank you very much, Taylor. That was very, very interesting. As you know, as I've read some of Arthur Conan Doyle's books and watched some of the movies and TV series that you just mentioned. So we have a lot of questions from our audience, and you mentioned that there have been a number of books after Conan Doyle passed away that feature Sherlock Holmes. Do you have a favorite, or can you recommend any that are particularly well done?
Well, I definitely recommend the Laurie Kingman, The Beekeeper's Apprentice. It's a very excellent novel, and really, again, there's a series of there. There's another one I kind of like. It's called, I believe the title is The Italian Secretary, and it's another very interesting take that's really true to the original of the Sherlock Holmes stories. But those that novel and then that series by Laurie King, those are the ones I would recommend. I guess for me would come to mind first and foremost.
Great, thank you. Now, you mentioned earlier that Doyle didn't really, or Sherlock Holmes didn't really have any political interests, right? Now, one of the questions here is, you know, what would he advise politicians nowadays, or even, you know, advise our intelligence agencies? Do you have any take on that?
Well, it's a lot easier to talk about his relationship to intelligence agencies. As far as Holmes and politics, he very much made forays into and dealt in politics, but he was usually not taking a position. It was usually trying to save somebody in a blackmail case. So, for example, a scandal in Bohemia I've mentioned several times. You know, Watson says, "Oh, I can't tell you all the details because, oh, you know, Holmes is not. You know, we don't want to give away what really was happening in this particular international intrigue." But Holmes is pretty much apolitical. He tends to be asexual. Now, a lot of people in our time wonder about Holmes and Watson. Do they have maybe a relationship of some kind, maybe romantic or homosexual? But he tends to be not really into that. Holmes is, I mean, like Holmes is more, he's very, how can I say, he's almost machine-like. He's very focused on solving cases. And now, as far as dealing with intelligence agencies, yes, absolutely. I'm sure he would be someone that they would be looking to at all times. Obviously, he works, I don't think I mentioned this, but famously works with Scotland Yard. And they are constantly coming to him, most famously Inspector Lestrade, but not the only one. But they are constantly coming to him and getting him to see if they can get him to help them solve cases that for them are baffling, but he always has right on the tips of his fingers.
Speaking of his relationships or lack of thereof, one of the questions that we're having here, why is it that Holmes was created with so little love interest? I mean, I remember that in one of the series with Benedict Cumberbatch in the series, that he used a relationship to get information, but beyond that, there was not much, Irene is there. But do you have a take on why he was created with so very little love interest?
I do. This is my opinion, but Holmes is such a product of science, of a scientific sort of way of thinking in his moment. Not just Darwin, but just in a broad sense, science as it existed in his time, and which is so focused. And I mean, obviously, Darwin he's an observational scientist. That's how he understood himself. And not to I don't want to oversimplify Darwin, but this concept of observation, of dispassionate insight. The series, The Big Bang Theory. Sheldon, he's Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he's the same guy. This idea of a kind of passionless figure. He is a man of science, and so that's part of what Doyle is doing, is making a case himself. I'm sorry to keep using that phrase, but he's making a case himself for science in the art of solving a case. So he's really promoting these ideas about forensics and science in solving cases and police work and that kind of thing. So criminology, So that's what he is doing. Again, it was so nice to see Samir Hinduja doing a lecture, one of my dear friends who's a criminologist. But I think that's why. I think the idea of him being passionate didn't really work. Watson kind of takes care of that because Watson's a literature guy,
Right. So he has a counterpart in Watson, really, in that regard as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned a good number of the TV series and the movies that were made. So several of our attendees here have the question, which one of these gets the closest to the actual Doyle character? And which one would you recommend to watch?
That's this is just the TV series, is what we're asking
TV
about?
or movies. Mm-hmm.
Or movies. That's so difficult to answer because they all get at some aspect of Holmes. I mean, here's the power of Holmes. He's so multidimensional. In a way, he's not very multidimensional, but he is very multidimensional and compelling. And really, each one of these screen presentations gets at him in a different way. And they're all of a different moment. Basil Rathbone is so of this World War II moment, and he captures that. You get a very different kind of figure with Benedict Cumberbatch, but they each articulate Holmes a different way. I would be hard put to pick a favorite, really. I like them all. Some days, you get up in the morning and eat, Lucky Charms, and other days you eat Weisswurst or something, So.
Thank you. So is there any other literary, character with as much commentary and recreation as Sherlock? And why would you think so?
Oh, that's a very, very fascinating question. You would be hard put to find many characters who have come alive in the ways that, Holmes has. I don't know, Rhett and Scarlett from Gone with the Wind tend to get a lot of focus, or did, or have in the past. There are a few out there, but there are. It's kind of, Superman maybe, Batman. In our time, there's a lot of work in comic book scholarship, and so there are people who will talk about those kind of characters a lot. But it's kind of it would be hard. You'd be hard put to find somebody at Holmes's level.
Do you know where the idea came from that Holmes had the counterpart with Watson? The question here is Holmes and Watson were a pair of buddies, like in buddy stories. Do you know where that idea actually came from, or if that's based on an earlier story?
Yeah, so very interestingly, the those stories by Poe, The Murder in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, the ones that feature Dupin, Dupin lives with a guy, or he stays a lot of the time with another guy. They're kind of like vampires, or almost like gay vampires. They spend the night, they're up all night and they're never awake in the daylight, and they're kind of interesting characters. But that was a precedent that I don't know how conscious Doyle was of it, and the dynamic is different, but it's a similar kind of thing though, where you're telling. It's not the sleuth who's telling the story; it's removed, and so you have a writer, telling that story. So I think that's probably, at least on some level, the precedent there.
Great. I know we have many more questions here. Those that we don't get to during our time, we will answer offline and we will post on our website. I'm going to end with one more question. If you're looking for a recording of this presentation, you can Google FAU Research in Action. You will find it there. The recording should be up in a couple of days or so. We had a number of questions on this. So Taylor, there's a relatively recent series with Enola Holmes, the little sister
Mm-hmm.
of the Holmes. Do you have any thoughts on
I
that?
should have, you know what? I'm not as familiar with it. And that's another one. I was thinking about that Elementary. Wanted to put the end date on that. And I'm familiar with that series, but not highly so. But it's something I want to check out more of. And let me say that again, I think this idea of trying to think about, okay, how's a woman, or in this, a young woman or a girl, how can we rethink or re-envision Holmes, this Holmes archetype? And I think, if you think about Holmes as an archetype, I mean, certainly, then he becomes sort of like Odysseus or someone like that. And maybe those characters, he would take his place, although it's kind of hard to imagine that. That's such a high inflated kind of place to be. But thinking about how those archetypes can be altered in certain ways, whether in terms of gender or race, is very interesting. And let me tell you, Holmes, by the way, is everywhere in terms of ethnicity or nationality. When I lived in Munich, I remember there was a detective agency that had a bust of Holmes on Tierstrasse. So he's everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. I've read several books where it was a female character who was Holmes. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Taylor. We will answer the remaining questions offline. Taylor, we're going to ask you to answer those because we do have a large number of additional questions. We thank you all for attending today. We hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Thank you again, Taylor. Thank you for attending. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you so much.